Last time we picked up God's narrative again with Adam and Eve enjoying the life God had given them in the Garden of Eden and enjoying their relationship with Him. Then Eve being willingly deceived by Satan, disguised as a snake. The man and woman eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the immediate disastrous results in the form of their shame and fear within God's creation, with each other, and most importantly before God. Evil and death in all its dimensions had now entered and become part of who they were, just as God had warned them that it would. So we left Adam and Eve ashamed, pathetically trying to cover their naked bodies with leaves sewed together, and now hearing God's approach, hiding from Him in fear. Never before had this been their response. Every time before they'd been grateful at His approach, glad for His presence, eager to talk with Him. In His narrative, this is in Genesis chapter 3 verse 9, God recounts how He called out to Adam asking where they were. Of course God knew where they were. He knew all that had taken place. So His calling out like this had a purpose other than to seek information. In fact, God was revealing important things about Himself, as He always, tirelessly does. Remember, He's the communicating God who speaks. It was His voice that had made Adam and Eve to hear. And even though now it produced fear and other responses, we'll see, He knew that it was His voice they needed to hear. They'd been deceived. They'd bought a lie, and it always is, the truth, God's take on things, His true version that they need. Even now, having turned away from Him, joined in Satan's rebellion, even with death and the fractured relationships stamped all over them, God reaches out to them. He takes the initiative, knowing that they are unable. As we'll see, God wanted them to acknowledge that He had spoken truly. And He wanted them to understand their desperate need of Him at this, their first and darkest moment as fallen creatures. Each of God's questions, this is starting in Genesis chapter 3, verse 9 and going to verse 13, beginning with the question, "Where are you?" are not intended for Him to find anything out, but rather to reveal things to them about Him, about themselves, about the realities they now found themselves in. And to give them opportunity, even at this late stage, to humbly acknowledge their culpability. One thing that His questions reveal too is where the real authority lies. Not with the enemy, certainly not with them, but with God Himself. He has every right to demand answers, and they knew it. Adam admits their fear, that they were hiding because of being ashamed at their nakedness. When God asked if they know this from having eaten of the forbidden tree, Adam gives his famous answer, whining that it was his wife's fault. And then she, in turn, of course, blames the serpent. Here, another pattern is set in place. Sadly, our human tendency to try to shift blame to someone else, to circumstances, to our upbringing, the bad crowd we fell in with. And modern psychology, of course, plays along with this, encouraging a culture in which those who claim the victim labels are no longer responsible for their thoughts and words and actions. No one, of course, was fooling God. No one was going to crawl out from under their responsibilities. Everyone was and always is held responsible for their choices and actions. With Him, all attempts to manipulate, to deflect, to spin things are totally futile. Because the narrative doesn't tell us, we've no way of understanding all the implications of the curse God now puts on the snake for being Satan's chosen disguise in his deception of Eve. This is Genesis chapter 3, verse 14. Then the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, you are cursed more than all animals, domestic and wild. You will crawl on your belly, groveling in the dust as long as you live." It's tempting to speculate, but all we can safely say is that It was reduced from that moment to the legless, slithering creature we're familiar with today. God will go on to pronounce other terrible results of the rebellion of his image bearers and until now, creation's caretakers. But first, in this, the darkest of times, when hope would otherwise have been extinguished in their hearts, God allows, he brings a small but bright pinpoint of light to shine, a hope, a lifeline to be grasped, even as they're realizing that they've rejected everything that was real and solid in their lives. Hope in the middle of the cold terror that must have been gripping their hearts. It's a promise. It's not clear in detail, but it's real and solid nonetheless. It's in the form of a revelation to the snake, really to Satan. He's told that his apparent recent victory will be fleeting. This is Genesis 3:15. God says, "And I will cause hostility between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head and you will strike his heel." A man, an offspring of the woman, will come who will do battle with this one who has sworn enmity with God and his created beings. Certainly Satan will inflict pain, but his will be the ultimate victory, the one who's coming. Satan's temporary reign will be brought to an end with his defeat. God is letting the man and woman know that although their story from now on will be full of pain and sorrow, his story, God's story, is still being written. No one but he, the Lord God, has the right to decide how it will end. This is who he is. Unwilling, unable in his holy being to relate to anyone on their terms, to tolerate offense to his perfection, but at the same time, always reaching out, reaching down in love. This kind of reaching down for no reason other than his loving choice can never be effectively labeled in human language, can it? In English, the best we have is the word grace, a word that has lost its coinage in common usage. Something to be constantly grateful for, though, is that we, unlike many other language communities, have his story available in our language. We have this wonderful opportunity to hear his story of how he reaches out in grace to rescue humans from their predicament. So we're not restricted to theoretical propositions, to dogma, dry theoretical statements. He wants our understanding of who he is in this and every aspect to grow within us as we listen and observe him in action, in real circumstances and contexts and in relationships. This part of the narrative, Genesis 3:17 to 19, concludes with God giving them some insights into the results of their disobedience, of the pain in childbirth that Eve will experience. The earth from which Adam had been formed and over which he had been given responsibility was itself cursed, changed. It was now a much harsher environment, a tough place to live. Life would be difficult and painful, and their needs would only be met with great challenge, hard physical work. And because they are the ancestors, the antecedents of all the human race, this is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 20, it says that the dire results, the great curse would come on all. Having chosen to try to write his own story, in many ways it would not be a pleasant one for man. Thankfully, God did not walk away. He will still have the final say in how things unfold for his lost image-bearing race.